So there's a football game tonight, I hear. And then the season will finally be over, right? Yeah. This is the latest date ever for a Super Bowl. I looked it up. It like goes on forever and ever. And then after that, we can get on to more important things, right? Like warm weather and baseball, right? Yeah. All right. Well, without doubt, the Super Bowl is a sort of national secular liturgy. It's filled with varied symbols of worship and traditions. In his book, A Matrix of Meanings, a writer named Craig Detweiler writes about it. He says, "This is a national day of gluttony for Americans to unabashedly embrace their joys of advertising, consumerism, and greasy foods. Football taps into our most violent survival instincts. It repeatedly draws a line in the dirt and dares opponents to cross it. While it offers rules of engagement, often the meanest and nastiest prevail. Football reminds us of who we are and how we got here, what battles had to be fought, what bodies had to be sacrificed to forge a nation. So it's kind of our national liturgy. But the amount of consumption on this day is absolutely startling. Even the cows, the cows from the Chick-fil-A commercial, even they have to be feeling bad for the chickens of the world on this day. 100 million pounds of chicken wings will be consumed. How many chickens had to give their lives for 100 million pounds of chicken wings? I don't get chicken wings. 53.5 million pounds of avocado will be consumed. 28 million pounds of potato chips. 8 million pounds of popcorn. How much volume of popcorn does it take to get 8 million pounds? Think about that. If you took all the guacamole, spread it across the entire football field, it would raise to a depth of 11.5 feet. 325 million gallons of beer will be consumed. This is the thing I least understand. That is enough to fill 500 Olympic-size swimming pools. So, football people, rejoice in your sport. Yes. So is there a way for both of these teams to lose tonight? Oh, there I go again. There I go, being snarky and negative. It's just such a natural human proclivity, especially if you're from New Jersey. I mean, it's just kind of the way you are, And honestly, I don't really hate either of these teams. I mean, the Broncos, they rightly submitted to God's servants, the Dallas Cowboys, in Super Bowl 12 in 1978. I remember that. In Carolina, how can you not like? How can you dislike Carolina? I mean, if you dislike them for basketball, that makes sense. But for football, So, actually, it was on the heels of that 1978 Cowboys victory over the Broncos, actually in the summer following it, that Diana and I, a year after we had gotten married, traveled from Collingswood, New Jersey, to Dallas, Texas. A couple of the other guys that I went to college with in Philadelphia were also doing the same at that time, as together we were going to be matriculating into Dallas Theological Seminary. Now, I was a Baltimore Colts fan at the time. I really was. I grew up a Colts and Eagles fan, did I just curse? I did. I grew up a Colts and Orioles fan, and but again, I'm a baseball guy trying to tolerate football. So being immersed in a totally pervasive Cowboys culture of Dallas, I gave in to the culture. And along with having a couple of the players, I did a swimming pool maintenance business thing while I was in my years in Dallas, and I had a couple of the players were clients and got to know them, and along the way, of course, there was in those days, there was the Christian connections with our church and with the seminary with Tom Landry and all the the Christian connections of that, and the church where I was minister of music, which was a really, really super wealthy congregation. Most of the people there had season tickets to the Cowboys. So we would never have church when the Cowboys were playing because it didn't make any sense. Nobody was there. In fact, God wasn't there. He was out at the stadium. That's why the hole was in the stadium, so he could see his team play. So anyhow, so that's what kind of the culture was like. So I gave in to all of that. But a couple of the other guys that had gone to seminary with me from the East, and they were really from the Philadelphia area, they refused to sell out to the predominant culture, and they remained in-your-face Eagles fans. I know that's hard to imagine, but in spite of being totally out of step with the rest of the world around them in Dallas, they wore the green. They were Eagles fans. Carl's not here. I'd pick on him. He's one of those, Carl often sits right up front here with his Eagles jersey. I mean, the only thing more difficult I can imagine being an Eagles fan in your face in Dallas would be being a Dallas fan in South Philadelphia. I mean, that would be worse. That would be harder. The food would be a lot better, but it would be a harder, more difficult life. But actually, this illustration of kind of being out of step with the predominant culture that you're around in football so significantly pales in comparison to what it was like for early Christians to be known for their faith in the hostile culture of the early church era of history in the decades and even the centuries after the time of Christ. And it was at this early time after Christ had ascended to the Father that Peter wrote his first letter, the first letter of Peter to, as he called them, the elect exiles, strangers in the world, yet chosen people by a loving God. And that persecution that they were beginning to feel, they're beginning to profoundly feel how tremendously out of step they were with the rest of the culture, is something that would grow and escalate in the centuries that would follow in this part of the world. The early Christians would often refer to Roman society as Babylon, a world whose stories and values ran entirely culture to the character of Christ and his teachings in the written word. And so Peter wrote this letter of encouragement to these scattered exiles, people often persecuted for their faith, a persecution that would increase in the centuries to follow. In an area of the world where the bulk of his readers would have been in a place called Cappadocia. Now, I've mentioned this before in this series, but I brought some pictures today to show you what Cappadocia looks like. I've said I was there on a missions research trip in 1999. This is what it looks like. It's like right out of the Flintstones. It actually is. People live in these houses in the soft volcanic rock. Go to the next one. And it's exactly what it looks like. And mingled in as you go on, you'll see kind of more modern types of structures intermingled with these other rock formations, and people live in both of them. This is a night shot. This is in a town in Turkey, in eastern Turkey is where this is. So this is a town called Gurame. And I was there with the Free Church, Evangelical Free Church mission, and we were discussing with town officials. You kind of look to the left of the picture, you see a number of windows close together there. There's like a restaurant sort of thing right in the mountain. Now, once you go through the doors, you go up the steps, you go through the doors, it looks like you're walking into the cave. But once you're inside, it doesn't seem any different than anything else. But we met with the town mayor there and so on about the idea of building a Christian cultural center there. And of course, as the years have gone by, the politics have made that not possible. But and then one more, they had actually layers of cities were built underground where Christians would go to escape in times when invading armies would come in persecution against them for their faith, and that's what one of the underground cities looks like. And so that's the kind of world and the kinds of people that Peter was writing to here. One of the stunning surprises in my 5 decades in America now, 6 decades in America living here, has been to see how the Christian faith and the value system has gone from being an informing, appreciated, defining element of American culture to that of now being oft despised, ridiculed, and rejected by growing numbers of people. And yet our situation, as we sense and feel that, all of us do, as we try to live for Christ out in the community, we feel that. And yet our situation is merely fractional in its negativity compared to what the suffering is experienced by many Christians in other corners of the world. The trends are indeed disturbing, both domestically and internationally. And so this letter that Peter wrote to these exiles is one that is timely for us as we kind of are living in a similar sort of growing era of hostility toward the teachings of Christ. And the question then and the question now is a timeless one. What does it mean to be a Christian in a changing world? Frustrated by the loss of what we might call traditional society informed by Christian standards. Many of Christ's followers find themselves today, as Peter's readers did, wrestling with fear and with anger at their situation. And the way that the culture is sort of, the church is now finding itself out of step with the culture, and the questions this raises will be, in fact, the feature of a series of messages that we're going to share with you in the spring season of this calendar year. But we're not alone in this feeling of being out of step. Peter describes, again, these people whom he writes to, these Christians, as elect exiles in the first verse of his letters. Strangers to the world, yet chosen by a loving God. Christians, therefore, what we do is we end up greeting suffering, not with clenched fists, but with, again, soft hearts, knowing that our hurt, our pain is only for a little while, as it says in the letter, while our hope stretches into eternity. So today we can choose to be angry and in despair about our predicament, or we can choose to function in the greater hope of the gospel message and take on life in this world with a new purpose, and that is our theme for today and our title for today. How faith in Christ gives us a new purpose in life, even in a crazy world around us. The natural proclivity of mankind is much illustrated in the political climate of an election season such as we are experiencing currently. The name of the game in the political culture is to be more right, and by that I mean correct, I don't mean right and left, to be more correct, to be more right than your opponents, and to make your opponents look wrong, and so it's all about winning and coming out on top. There's a large part of me that actually loves that game. And as many of you know, I have at seasons of life been deeply involved in that game. And let me say that it is a worthy endeavor, an honorable thing to fight for truth and for good systems and structures of life and of governance. And many of God's people are called to do just that. But what drove me crazy was that for way too many people that I got to meet, the political game was not so much about accomplishing good, but simply about playing the game. The game was the end as well as the means. It was all about winning. And it often seemed like more of the time was spent with the people on my own team, the teammates fighting for varied captaincy types of positions on our own team rather than fighting to win in the public arena of ideas in the culture. But Christians can be this way as well. It can be this way in a world that does not share our value system. And when we come into conflict with that value system, to be kind of political and to be like the season of the year that we're in, and to engage in a way that's combative and that's all about winning and defeating the other person and their ideas in the system. But God calls us to something bigger than that, something better than that, of a way of living, even suffering in a hostile culture, and to live out our life with a new purpose, essentially to live our life on mission for God. And many times suffering is actually an enabling device to help us more successfully even win and live, win in the things of eternity, and be on a successful mission for God. So how do we live on mission? How do we have this new purpose in life? And as we go to our text today in 1 Peter 3, there are three things that I would like to emphasize from our text today. The first is these, that chosen strangers, the elect of God, value being redemptive over simply being right. A culture that's based in individualism responds to suffering through anger and through thoughts of retaliation. But within the church, winning relationships matter more than a victorious pride that wins simply the debate. Here's what it says. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Of course, that's a quote from the 34th Psalm there in verses 10, 11, and 12. In this passage here about being like-minded, sympathetic, and these qualities, who is it that Peter is writing to and speaking to? And he's writing again to these believers. Is he talking about this is the way that people should be in the family of faith with each other? Or is he saying this is the way that they should be in the world around them? And I think the answer is actually both of those, starting, of course, and certainly within the family of faith, and then successfully living well in these qualities in the family of faith, as that is seen and expressed from the inside to the outside of the world around. It becomes a very attractive element of the message of the gospel of Christ. So what are these qualities that are described here? Look back again at verse 8. There are 5 qualities you see right away here. Being like-minded. Literally, the words there in the original words mean being of one mind, of having one mind. Different people, but drawing from one mind. It's like having a common hard drive, a common database from which you think and act. The second word being sympathetic. Supamphes is the Greek word, which means you hear the word sympathy in that. Not just thinking alike, but feeling alike. We see thirdly the idea of loving one another, and this is the Philadelphos word of brotherly love for each other. The fourth of being compassionate. The words here literally draw on the idea of having just a common gut feeling between people. In the ancient world, they thought of emotions as being seen as in the core and in the gut of a person. And so the words speak of this having this common feeling that is there. And then the idea of being humble, which meant then as it means to us and today. And the summary of these qualities that are being described as to how we should be in the family of faith as we live in front of a world is that everything about us as a group is the same as who we are individually, and we're that as a group as well. That we have the same thoughts, the same feelings, the same emotions. Even being different people, we ultimately have all of this stuff in common, the same emotions, the same drive that defines who we are together. Have you ever had that person in life? It could be somebody you've had in business, or it could be somebody you've done something with in maybe the athletic arena or something like that, where whatever it is you're doing and something's going on and it's a little wild and it's a little frenzied and confusing, and all you have to do is watch the eyes here. All you have to do is look at that person. You look and you got it. You know what they're thinking. You know what they're feeling. You just, because you're coming from the same, you got that person, you have that oneness with. You're coming from that same place in the way that you look at stuff. That's how the family of faith should be together. That even though we're diverse and different, and certainly at Tri-State, we've got one of everything in this room. And God has made us this diverse congregation. Yet on the bottom line, and the stuff that's really important, all we got to do is look, because we got the same ideas about who God is, about what the gospel is, about what our mission is in the world, and so on. It says here what not to do in the passage: to share insult for insult, to repay evil with evil. In other words, don't do what politicians do in a debate. I think there was one of those last night. I chose not to look. It's Saturday night. I didn't need that on Saturday night. Don't do what comes naturally, actually, which is to try to do one up on the other person. And nobody's better at that than people from New Jersey. Trust me when I say that, all right? And but what to do? Rather, it says, be totally counterintuitive by returning good for evil. And doing this within the church family, what it does is it builds family together. And this extends then to the outside world. As it extends to the outside world, it is a display of something that's beyond, something that's different, that's attractive, and it's categorically unique from the natural ebb and flow of interpersonal relationships in life. So Peter demonstrates the timeless nature of this as truth by quoting from something from 1,000 years before, the 34th Psalm. And that psalm that he quotes from, whoever would love to see life and love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil, their lips from deceitful speech, turn from evil, do good, seek peace, pursue it, and so on. It's a timeless truth of what brings God's blessing and success in life. So that is the first statement that we can make about how do we live on mission. We can be redemptive over simply being right. The second thing to say is this, from verses 13 to 15, that chosen strangers value love over merely wallowing and being offended. It's tempting to respond to injustice by becoming offended by something we see in our world. But because Christians have the blessing of the gospel, Christians are set free to love the world rather than just be offended by that which is so different. It says in the text, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you're blessed. Do not fear their threats. Again, here we're quoting now from Isaiah chapter 8, verse 12. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Peter's opening question here is rhetorical in nature. He's basically saying, if you have the Father's, if you have God's blessings, who else's approval do you really need? Therefore, the idea of doing good and living peaceably becomes a vital part of Christian living. A writer in the Christian world, a guy named Paul Cedar, in a devotional commentary he wrote. Paul Cedar, by the way, was the president of our denominational affiliation, the Evangelical Free Church, from 1990 to 1996. He wrote, Christians have an incredible contribution to make to the society in which they live by breaking the cycle of people returning evil for evil. As we begin to do good, most people will return that good by doing good. What a marvelous ministry with very immediate and measurable results. Just as people tend to return evil for evil, they usually return good for good. Indeed, when you do good, blessing comes to everyone involved. We had 3 of our grandchildren for a period of 8 days over the last week, ending on Friday. And that's why you may notice that Diana and I are still shaking a bit and vibrating. But ages 6, 4, and 21 months. And fighting is kind of a part of the system there. And when one is calm and one takes the kind route and serves the other, the entire situation deflates and changes, and peace rules the day. But does this always work in a sinful and fallen world? Does seeking the high ground of peace and kindness and returning good instead of evil, does it always work in a sinful and fallen world? No, it doesn't, honestly. I think of that guy years ago in the uprising in China, the guy in Tiananmen Square. Remember him standing in front of the tank that was coming toward him. The tank went left and right and didn't want to run him over, and eventually didn't run him over. That's the more common thing that will happen when you return good for evil. It really is. Once in a while, though, you'll get someone who will just take the tank and go right over top of you. But just because doing the best and the right thing does not always work out in a sinful and fallen world does not mean that it is not the right thing to do. Understand now, we're not talking here about ignoring or overlooking laws that are broken or criminal activity just to have peace at all costs. But we're talking more about the natural ebb and flow of human interaction and relationship in the realm of inserts and insults and this sort of thing. And the overall thrust here is, again, not to measure oneself by the approval of society, but to measure oneself by the approval of a holy God. And if we have God's approval, why would we need to worry about receiving the approval of society around us? We should instead live for the God who gives us honor by virtue of the Son who bore our shame. And that's exactly the next thought of Peter. And that's the third thing we look at today as we see how Christ has been an example of the very thing that we're talking about. Beginning in the middle of verse 15 and through verse 18, a third point today is that chosen strangers value kingdom purpose over cultural preference. Most significantly, suffering does provoke mission in our response. We see this in the example of Christ. It would perhaps be more pleasant for us to go with the flow of life around us and find peace by simply getting along and going along. Living on mission is the higher calling of being connected to God's work. It says in the text, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it's God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. Now, our passage today goes on in verses 19 to 22, and it gets into some thoughts on Christ speaking to spirits in prison, and to know some stuff about Noah and baptism, and it's very, very, very confusing stuff that I'm not going to give time to this morning. Check our online resources. Wednesday and Thursday, I'll tackle those questions and what that passage is talking about. But today, let's finish with looking how Christ is an example of the attitude of service that we want to be about, and the new mission that we have, and the new purpose that we have as God's people. You know, in the early portions of what we're sharing, the thoughts we're talking about today, it may seem that what we're talking about this passage is that we should be about deflecting insults and returning blessings. It might seem like we're just saying, just let yourself go out there, just be run over, and don't ever stand up for anything that's right. Peace is everything. No. The idea is to live by what you do, what is right, and live that with an attitude of love for people. And that pattern of living inevitably over time gives opportunity and opening for people who will ask questions about the motivating principles in your life that is displayed in this kindness that's so incredibly counterintuitive. It's just strange. Why? Why are you this way? And then the gospel can be presented. Your message of hope, and again, as the text says, done with gentleness and with kindness and respect. It may be received, and it will be received by some as God prospers his word through you. But many others will scoff at it and write off that truth and that message as ridiculous. And they'll write you off with it and mock you with it. But again, stay on course. Again, it encourages us, don't fight back in like manner. We'll say, well, you're an idiot too, because you don't believe, whatever. You don't do that. It says, stay on course. Don't fight back in like manner. Let their false and the vociferous manner by which they betray themselves by wrongly being malicious towards you, let that be obvious to everyone, because the evidence doesn't support, your life evidence doesn't support the things that they are saying. And he goes on to say in the passage basically this: if you're going to suffer, he doesn't say it this, but it's true. If you're going to suffer, and you will at times, it's better for doing so, for being and doing the right thing, than being and doing the wrong thing. Again, he's basically saying it's better to be a Cowboys fan and lose than a Redskins fan and win. All right? No, I jest. I kid, I think. But you get the picture. Well, how might this look in a church that lives and serves in a community, like church like this, in a community like that out there? It probably looks like a church that takes a week to serve at the local homeless shelter with about 100 people helping with that. It probably looks like a church that adopts needy families in the community at Christmas time and seeks to make that a better day than they might otherwise have experienced. It's probably a church with a Friday bunch of guys who in the morning go to breakfast and then spend much of the day serving and doing something like building equipment for Camp Wild's ministry or putting a roof on a rescue mission. It probably looks like a church that cares about widows and widowers and expresses that care in some kind of practical project. I tell you the story again. Last year, I'm in Rotary Club, and Lou Scally sat down by me. He said, hey, today someone called in and said there's this church, and they were so impressed that they came and they shared some things, and they're a widow, and they're wondering what church, did I know what church, is that your church, Randy, who did that? I like it when people come up and ask me things like that. It probably looks like a church that cares about the local pregnancy center by supporting its ministries and contributing to it, contributing and being a part of ministries to children and youth in the community, things like Young Life and Fellowship of Christian Athletes and Cedar Ridge, and to places far away with maybe like an orphanage and special needs home in some place like maybe Kazakhstan, or also being a part of seeing mission churches planted in other places like Thailand and Australia and Spain and Brazil, and having some people who live in Scotland and work with asylum seekers out of Iran. And when there's a natural disaster, it's probably a church that will send dozens, even hundreds of people to places like New Orleans or the Jersey coast to help people get through that and to preach the gospel along the way. This kind of church might also send a couple of their own church kids and their growing families to do worldwide radio ministry, that even in places where the gospel can't be taken on foot, the radio waves can go with that ministry. Or maybe even they'd send another of their church families to go to people who come here and prepare them to go back. Like maybe medical students that come to Johns Hopkins University to study there and to present the gospel there, see them come to Christ and equip them to go back as missionaries to their own country and their own people. It's that kind of thing that is about being on mission in the world and having a new purpose in life. And that's a high purpose. Those are fantastic things, and you know who I'm talking about here. But there's even more things that we can do. Let me tell you a little story about our partner church in Washington, D.C. We have a church in Washington, D.C., and my son Jesse goes there. It's on Capitol Hill, and they actually meet in the afternoon. They meet in it's called Redemption Hill Church. So Capitol Hill, Redemption Hill. And they meet in a very traditional old stone church building, stained windows and all of that, though their service is really almost exactly like ours. And Diane and I, when we go there, we're like the oldest people there by like maybe 25 years. I mean, it's all these young people or staff. A lot of them are Capitol Hill staff people working in government and so on. And God is just really prospering this ministry. Now, they do small group ministries just as we do small group ministries. But here's kind of a way they do small group ministries. They're called their group missional groups. And the purpose for their small group ministry is that people come together and they have a defined sort of project that they are working on and serving in whatever kind of geographic community within the Capitol Hill or surrounding areas to Washington there. And they serve in various ways in missional ministry and serving people. And along the way, they also do some study of Scripture together and unpacking the kinds of things that we do second hour. I mean, they do all these sorts of things as well. But their purpose that defines them is the missional activity that they're doing in the community. Now, I'm not saying that we should necessarily do all our small group ministries this way. I'm just saying you can see how this kind of thing and this kind of way of being the church in the community is applying the kind of passage of Scripture that we're looking at today and these principles that Peter is talking about today. So I'm not saying we should do our home groups that way, although that would be fine. But I am saying that we are going to be asking you more and more to live out this passage in some ways that might look like some of that. I'm going to ask you to live out this passage in the coming several years as we will, I think, note more and more that the people who come and join us in this room are very diverse and different from who we have historically been in our first 3 decades as a church. And I'm going to challenge you as well in these coming couple of years to, and I don't even know what this means yet. I'm trying to figure it out myself. I'm going to be, I'm planning even to go to Dallas in April, and I'm going to meet with Tony Evans and urban alternative people there in a conference event about what this looks like in being the church in the community and having an impact in specific communities and in the social thing that holds that community often together, which is the school in that community. How can we be God's people out in the community, living for God, and along the way saying, well, here's why we do this. It's because of the purpose that we have in life, because of what God has done for us. And we invite you to come and be a part of that with us and live on mission with us as well. This is doing the work of eternity in the here and now, of loving in the way that we live together and the way that we serve together, and we live truth, and we be God's people with a new purpose, living on mission for Him.